Welcome to the Policy Shop, weekly conversations with public policy experts where we'll dive into the most important issues affecting all of us here in Illinois. I'm Hilary Gowins. Let's get started. Today, we'll be talking about the 2-year anniversary of COVID-19 lockdowns and how they changed Illinois. Bryce, thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me as always.
So we've spent a lot of time at the Institute over the past 2 years talking to small business owners about what life has been like for them as they've navigated shutdown orders, supply chain issues, and now, the high cost of doing business, especially if you need to travel or anything like that. And it's been really helpful to hear from business owners, but it's been really hard to hear everything they've been going through. And so today I'm really glad to have you on because I think you'll be able to help us make sense of, what life has actually been like over the past 2 years and how Illinois' economy has changed in the wake of not only the pandemic, but everything that came with it, meaning government ordered lockdowns.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been an interesting couple of years, especially as, states take different approaches and we see far different outcomes across the states, despite a relatively similar experience, with battling COVID and trying to manage public health and the economy and things like that.
So you did some really interesting analysis just this past week, and you looked at numbers that showed how Illinois' economy is doing both overall and then by industry. So what did you see when you looked at those numbers?
Yeah, so you see that, Illinois is still missing nearly twice as many jobs as the national economy. So there's over 200,000 jobs still missing relative to the state's pre-pandemic peak in January of 2020. And so the downturn was, slightly worse in Illinois than in most other states. But what's really been lagging has been the recovery. And the interesting thing about it is, the Federal Reserve put out a study recently to look at what is driving different outcomes across states. And they identified 3 things, the first of which was industry mix. So states that are particularly reliant on service industries, particularly the leisure and hospitality industry, those are the states who still 2 years later are suffering the most. But what's important to note about Illinois' economy is more diversified than most other states, and it's less reliant on the leisure and hospitality industry in general for jobs than the national averages. And despite this, the state's economy is missing twice as many jobs as the national average. Nationwide, jobs are down 1.8%. That figure is 3.3% here. And across every single major industry except for other services, which is kind of a catch-all term in the service industry for things that don't fit into leisure and hospitality, educational, health, or professional and business services. Every single industry is suffering more than the national average. So we have industries that are missing jobs or missing more jobs. And then in the very select few industries that have actually increased payrolls in the past 2 years, they're either not increasing in Illinois or they have increased at a much, much lower rate than the national average.
So industry by industry, okay, got it. So you're saying that our economy is actually more diversified than other states, and that's a good thing, and that should protect us from a more severe shock, but actually the numbers aren't reflecting that. What do the numbers look like for the restaurant industry in particular? I know we've spoken with a lot of small business owners who are restaurants, who have restaurants. So for example, we spoke with a guy named RG Carafodius who has the Golden Brunch Cafe out here in Arlington Heights. He's a first generation American, came here, launched this cafe after basically not speaking English. Then 5 years later, he's a business owner. And he was doing great. He had grown the business to like $1 million business. And then COVID hits. And he says, they had to adapt really fast, right? So all of these rules go into place for indoor dining, only doing takeout. If you do indoor dining again months later, you have to have all of these different regulatory things in place, like, plastic panels between your stalls or whatever. So he talked a lot about how he had to be really nimble. But what is that, how does that affect the restaurant industry overall?
Yeah, so overall, the restaurant industry lost almost half of their jobs. So you went from an industry that's 600, 700,000 jobs strong in Illinois, and you cut that down to around 300,000 jobs. So, 1 in 2 people who are working in that industry suddenly find themselves unemployed. Many of the businesses temporarily closed. Some of them were fortunate enough to reopen. Many of them, we've spoken to, a lot of them haven't been as fortunate. They didn't make it all the way through. So those numbers are devastating. We're still missing 84,000 jobs from the leisure and hospitality industry. Of the missing jobs in Illinois, 42% of them are from the leisure and hospitality industry. So it's really the largest sector of the economy that's weighing down on Illinois' performance. And that's because we had such, heavy-handed responses to COVID-19 that made it incredibly difficult for these businesses to operate. That's no exception nationwide. That industry has been the hardest hit across all states, essentially, because these are the places that we were first told to cut out of our lives, and that was the easiest thing for us to do to stop the spread. But it took a real toll on these businesses, and as other states have opened up, that hasn't been the case in Illinois. Jobs are missing 30% more jobs in the industry are missing in Illinois than are nationwide. So the disproportionate effect, has been narrowed a little bit for Illinois versus the rest of the country there, but the rest of the country's job losses are primarily focused in this industry, whereas in Illinois, they're not only focused in this industry, they're spread across everywhere else too.
I guess something that RG said that stuck with me was this idea of being nimble, being flexible. So the restaurants, all small businesses that survived this thing had to be really flexible, and they had to adapt really quickly just to survive. And you and I have talked a lot about how this idea of flexibility translates to the government's response to a downturn, whether it's the Great Recession or COVID-19. So talk about Illinois' ability to be flexible, or inability to be flexible. How does that affect its ability to adapt to a change in economic circumstances?
Yeah, the inflexibility in Illinois really extends itself in 2 ways. So first, as we mentioned up top, we've had executive orders that were blanket. They didn't make any exceptions for the size of your business, or how able you were to respond to rules and requirements that suddenly were being issued overnight and taking place. So you had that, which is obviously going to disproportionately affect small businesses who are more cash strapped. They can't put into place plastic barriers as easily as a big box retailer might be able to, or a chain restaurant is. You also then have the fiscal side of things from the state, who is demanding tax dollars from small businesses and residents of the state. That didn't change. Businesses, homeowners, individuals across the state were still having to pay income taxes. They're still having to pay property taxes, which are second highest in the nation. So those things didn't go away. And what Illinoisans really needed in this time, and what states really have, there's only so much that a state can do in terms of stimulus. The federal government was issuing trillions of dollars in stimulus. And they have the tools of monetary policy to affect interest rates and things like that to keep them low. States, their purview is much more narrow. So we can look at tax policy, and we can look at where we spend the money. And what Illinoisans really needed was some tax relief, whether that be a pause in property taxes or a suspension in property tax increases or tax increases of any kind. Excuse me. And then the second part of that would be delivering services that Illinoisans are relying on, or that Illinoisans need in a time of crisis. This is, the past 2 years have been when many Illinoisans have needed their government to step up more than any other time in their lives. But there's a lot of rigidity inside of the state spending side of the equation, the state budget, because we have so many of our finances tied up in fixed costs like pensions or retiree healthcare costs that don't allow for changes in our spending priorities. So when we should have been focused on either job training and diverting resources to helping people who are out of work adapt and find new skills that could put them into a position to either have the skills necessary to work from home in this new economy, or for bettering themselves to when the economy does reopen, they can level up their careers and find more advanced jobs, and not have this long gap in their employment history that is really hindering to somebody who's marginally attached to the labor force, especially those people who are kind of in these fringe areas. When they're knocked out of the labor force and their skills don't continue, they're out of practice and their skills don't continue to grow, it makes it tremendously difficult for one, an employer to hire them, but then two, for them to get back into the swing of things and continue to find, gainful employment. So there are all sorts of things that other states may have done, or Illinois could have done, had there been flexibility in where the state was able to spend its money and how it was able to raise its money, that just unfortunately weren't the case in Illinois.
I think that's probably the most frustrating thing looking back at all of this and then thinking about how we move forward, is just the fact that it feels like we just had this a similar scenario occur the last decade. We had the Great Recession not that long ago. And with that situation, we saw that it took Illinois nearly a decade to recover. One of the reasons was that right after the recession hit, the state hiked income taxes, which is counter to what you just said. So, you articulated this really clearly, and it was really helpful to hear you say there aren't a lot of levers that the state can pull other than providing tax relief at the state level and then investing in things that help people get back on their feet. And that didn't happen after the Great Recession. And now again, we're seeing all sorts of negative effects for people who are just trying to get by, whether it's, we're paying $6 like a gallon at the gas station, which is not helped by the fact that each year Illinois' gas tax goes up. Thank you, JB. But, it just feels like a rinse and repeat of the Great Recession. And I don't understand how we didn't learn anything from that. I know JB is trying to say he's offering $1 billion in temporary tax relief in this coming budget, but is that what you're talking about in terms of what's actually helpful?
No. So I mean, while, tax relief of any sort would be, a welcome reprieve for Illinoisans, we also need to think about what the long-term costs of that are. So, one thing that, is really that promise of the $1 billion in tax relief is a campaign promise. We're coming up on an election year, and we are, seeing politicians get into the swing of things. And so $1 billion in property tax relief, freezing the gas tax after it was just doubled, and then has now been indexed to automatically increase year after year, isn't really much of tax relief. It's just, hey, we're not going to hit you quite as hard as we were planning on. And then the other part of that is, we are under serious threat to have business tax hikes automatically implemented because of the unemployment insurance funds they're still severely depleted. We haven't really taken advantage of federal money to restore those funds. So a small business tax hike could be coming automatically in the form of, unemployment insurance taxes at the state level. So there's not really any tax relief that's coming. And then to touch on the larger point, when you look at the years leading up to the Great Recession, from the early 2000s to now, spending hasn't really gone up on much of anything, any line item in the state budget except for pension costs. So education spending is down across the state, but pension spending is up 500%. The state budget's larger, we're paying higher taxes. There's been 2 record income tax hikes in the past 10 years. They tried to pass through a third in 2020 with the progressive income tax hike. So taxes and what you're paying to the state are going up, but what you're getting in exchange for those tax dollars is going down. So we haven't really learned, the lessons of the Great Recession, which were, we had this devastating, prolonged downturn. We had, hundreds of thousands of people out of work, and we weren't able to get these people back into the workforce quick enough, and we weren't able to attract job creators to the state at a fast enough rate to bounce back even close to what our Midwestern peers were doing, let alone the national average or states that are growing the fastest. So we didn't necessarily learn a whole lot from that. And I'm hoping that case is a little bit different this time around, especially since things were so severe and happened on such an accelerated timeline. I know we're talking 2 years out at this point, but the Great Recession was such a prolonged downturn and then a slow, tenuous march towards recovery, where relatively speaking, this downturn has been sudden and the bounce back has also been incredibly quick. So hopefully, this accelerated pace of everything can highlight, how flexible we need to be.
There was nothing during the pandemic was funny, but to me it was funny because there was this period of time when every economist was trying to predict which letter shape the recovery would look like. We're going to have a V-shaped recovery or an L-shape or whatever it was. What's Illinois' letter? What's our shape recovery?
It probably more resembles something that like your kindergartner tries to write on his paper when he's learning how to spell. So, I'm not, I know that a lot of lip service has been paid to the shape of recoveries, and it really depends on how you measure it. So, a lot of people talk about a V-shaped recovery and they cite, GDP or something bouncing back and making a full recovery. Other people, show a K or a W in terms of, bisecting the economy by high skilled versus low skilled or high income versus low income workers. Or then other people, say an L-shaped recovery and just look at total jobs. And then I think you combine all those things and you get the one big scribble. That's really hard to tell. In some areas there hasn't been any recovery and the recovery's, barely made gains. In other areas, things are bouncing back towards relative normalcy. So that's my answer.
All right. Well, thank you for speculating. I like the answer that it looks like my kindergartner's scribble. But this story is going to continue on. It has legs. We're going to continue to watch how the economy is performing, what the recovery looks like, who is thriving and who's getting left behind. And I always look to you for answers on that because you know all the data and you're able to see that clearly. So thank you so much for translating and for looking at the past 2 years and helping us understand what they've meant for the economy here.
Absolutely. Happy to help.